This is how you can quarantine your fish with the least amount of risk possible. Watch closely because the many fish keepers that follow these steps have great success, but skipping just one of these could lead to potential outbreak in your aquarium. So what makes a good quarantine routine? What do the successful fish keepers know that we don't? I spoke with a large group of fish keepers to hear about what they had to say about quarantining their fish. These fish keepers all fall into 3 categories, and in this video, I'm going to walk you through them. Should you quarantine? So the answers to this question fall into 3 groups. So the first answer is by far the least amount of work, or at least upfront. Should you quarantine your fish? No. Some people said that they don't quarantine their fish because they don't have the room or the space, or they don't think it's worth it. Some even said that because so many fish die during quarantine, that if they don't quarantine, their fish won't die. The problem with not quarantining your fish is that it introduces a whole lot of unnecessary risk into your aquarium. You really just have no way of knowing what kind of potential parasite or fungal or bacterial infection that you're introducing into your fish. You could be introducing the newest fish plague into your aquarium and you wouldn't know it, and you've done nothing to prevent it. You might have had a really nice community with all kinds of different fish and plants and everything, and it's been going on for years. Maybe you've had some breeding and stuff going on in there, and you introduce a new fish and you just skip the whole quarantine process entirely, and you could just accidentally introduce something like ick, and it might wipe out a lot of the fish in your tank, or all of them sometimes. So it's really, I don't feel like that's worth it. You really have no idea of what's going to happen, and it's a pretty big gamble with a lot of risk, and I don't think it's worth it. Now the second category is a little interesting. So the second category is maybe. So the big thing with the maybe category is you go to the same fish store, most of your fish come from the same place, and you've seen it, you go in there, it's clean, they have a lot of people working there, and they clean the tanks routinely, everything's well lit, you don't see any fish that are sick at the store, all the tanks have no mold or anything at the bottom of them, everything looks clean and pristine, none of the fish look sick, and when you're looking, they look nice and healthy, and you buy what you think is a nice and healthy fish, and most of the time you take them home and they're healthy and they're fine. You've done this many times at the same store over and over, and you've never had an issue. You don't feel like you need to quarantine your fish this time because last time you didn't and it was just fine, and this time everything looks good or even better, so you think that you can just skip it. And then the other side of that is you might have been going to a new store that you don't know, you don't trust, and maybe the tanks are a little bit more dirty. Maybe you might have seen some tanks that had fish that looked like, maybe there were a couple dead ones floating in there. Maybe you saw ick in one tank, but not the one that you were getting a fish out of. There's all kinds of things that could make a fish store look like it's maybe a little bit less trustworthy. So in those cases where you don't think you can trust the store, or you trust the water that the fish came out of, you might be more inclined to do a quarantine process. However, you might not have done that quarantine if it was from a store that you bought from before and you've had no problems. So sometimes you don't quarantine because you know the source, but then other times you do quarantine because you don't know the source. And in the same realm of maybe, you might have just not quarantined a fish, you added it to your tank, and you watched it for a little while, you watched it over the course of a week, and you might have noticed it's acting kind of weird, or maybe another fish in your tank is now acting weird, or has like a little spot, or like a little fuzzy patch, or something that's wrong, and it's all happening after you added a new fish. You then remove that one fish, and you take it into a quarantine tank, and now as a reaction to all the stuff that you've seen, you then take the fish and put it into quarantine. Now, the positive side of this more reactionary approach is that it is a lot less work than quarantining every single fish all the time. However, that doesn't mean that it comes without its downsides. There's a few problems that I can see with this approach. The first thing is, if you see a problem fish with something like ick or some kind of parasite or anything like that, the chances are if it's in the tank in one fish, you might as well just assume that it's in the tank with all of the fish. You can't just pull one fish because you have ick. You're not really going to be doing that much, because you could remove that one fish and start treating it, and then you might have just completely skipped all the eggs and any of the free swimming ick that was in the water, and now it's affecting everything else. So it doesn't matter if you just take out one fish whenever you see something. It might help, you might get lucky. However, if you see a problem in one fish, you might as well just assume all these fish are in the same water, it's a small space, and they're close proximity. If there's anything contagious, you just need to assume right off the bat that everything in the tank has it. So you might get lucky and have no problem, or you might get lucky by having one fish with a problem and you treat it and everything is fine. However, if you're not lucky, you better hope that it's not a big tank. You better hope it's not one of those big community tanks like a 55, 75, anything bigger than that, because you're gonna have to start using a lot of medication to start treating some of these. A lot of times if you get medicine like Maricin, it comes in a packet that treats every 10 gallons. So you might be having to put 7, 8, 9, 10, 15, 20 of these packets into your aquarium if you didn't quarantine in the first place. That gets very expensive very quickly. The second issue I have with trusting the source of your fish is you might not be thinking about how fish get sick and how a fish's immune system is actually working. So for the most part, a healthy fish is stress-free and has a nice strong slime coat on it. That slime coat is acting as a very first defense against contagions and things like ick and other parasites. A healthy fish could be exposed to something like ick, but the ick might not be able to penetrate a nice strong slime coat, and it might just be able to fall off before it actually starts causing a problem. When a fish gets stressed, that slime coat begins to get diminished, leaving the fish more vulnerable. So now that we're talking about fish stress, we need to think about what's happening when you buy a fish. So first of all, when you get a fish, it's either going to be wild caught or it's going to be captive bred in some facility, and it's most likely going to be not in America. That fish is going to get caught and bagged up and removed from its original water source and then put in some kind of new water. And then, it's going to be in a bag, it's going to get put in a box, and it's going to get shipped. During this process, it's going to be, in a small bag, it's going to be shaken around, it's going to be in a box on a plane, in the back of a van, or in a truck or something. Eventually, that fish is going to make it to a distributor or wholesaler, something like that. At the wholesaler, it's going to be handled again, it's going to be removed from the bag and put in entirely new water, and sometimes it's going to be mixed in with other fish from other places in the world, and all these fish are also going to be stressed, which makes them more vulnerable for diseases. During this time, it's especially dangerous because you have all these fish that are all vulnerable to diseases, but you're having fish from different areas of the world where some of these fish don't have the same kind of like antibodies and stuff for some of these diseases. Some of these fish don't have the natural resistances to something that might be found on the other side of the world. So while the fish is at a distributor or wholesaler, it's vulnerable and it might pick up something strange that it's not used to, and then it gets packed up again, and then it gets put in a bag and in a box, and same deal again, where it's either in a van or a truck or in an airplane, and it's getting shaken up again, and it's in a small space that it's not a cycled tank, it's a bag. Then the fish is sent to a fish store where it's once again handled, it's once again put into a whole new set of different water parameters and surrounded by other different fish. This whole process is just stressing the fish out, and it's making it incredibly vulnerable. So while the store might be clean and the tanks look clean and the fish looks good, the fish is actually pretty stressed out at this point, which means that it's more vulnerable for anything. And then for the final time, you take that fish and you bring it home. So it goes from another set of water into your water, and now you're putting a fish that is very vulnerable to disease and illness, and you're putting that in your tank. So even if that fish is healthy, it's still vulnerable and stressed out, so it's very susceptible to any kind of disease that you could have in your tanks. So that's kind of like a lesser thought of reason of why you should be quarantining, because if you think about it, that quarantine is kind of like a hotel where the fish can just go and hang out and relax. Even if you're not adding any medicine, you're just taking a fish from doing all this traveling and you're gonna put it in a nice clean, dimly lit hotel room where it can just relax and catch its breath and regain its strength before it has to go and be introduced to a tank, which is a little bit stressful for it as well. Like if you think about it, if you go on like a long road trip or a long cross-country flight or anything like that, after a long trip you just want to rest for a little bit and regain your energy, regain your strength. That's the same thing that's happening when you quarantine a fish. So the reactionary approach is still better than nothing, but it's also still a lot of risk. And if you think about it, the amount of risk really isn't that much lower if you're doing a reactionary approach. And it also all depends on how quickly that you can see something going wrong and do something about it. And even if you do something about it, you might be too late and you're gonna have to treat the whole tank instead of just a smaller quarantine. Now moving on from the no and maybe group, you may have guessed it already, but the last group is yes, you should quarantine your fish all of the time. This is by far the most reliable way of keeping new problems out of an established aquarium. There is still and always will be a risk whenever you're adding something new into your tank, but it's gonna be much lower if you've taken the proper precautions and quarantined a fish properly. Even if you're not adding medication when you're doing a quarantine, just having the fish in a stress-free environment could be very beneficial. Optionally, you could add some medication like any kind of broad spectrum medicine or a dewormer or things like that. This would further lower the risk of introducing anything like that into your main aquarium. The downside to always quarantining all of your fish all of the time is that it takes more time and it takes more work. And if you're impatient, then you see the fish at the store, you want to put it in your tank, you buy it, and now you're still gonna wait like 2-3 weeks, maybe more, before you add it to your tank. Putting the negatives aside though, the pros are much better than all the other alternative methods. You greatly increase how successful you could be without introducing anything unwanted into your aquarium. So in this hobby, there's no right or wrong answers, there's no one single way it has to be done, but there's always options. And the thing is that you personally have to assess the situation and make a judgment call on how much risk versus reward you're willing to accept. You have to weigh the options and see what's going to be best for you. For me, if I'm adding a new fish into my community tank, I might quarantine it for just a couple weeks. However, if I'm adding a new fish into like my main display tank where I have 8 to 10-year-old fish, I might quarantine something for a couple weeks to a couple months before I add it to that tank. It's all about you personally weighing the options and doing what you're most comfortable with. If you're quarantining fish or setting up a quarantine tank soon, check out the video on the left side of the screen. Thanks, and I'll see you in the next one.